You know, as we think about all these students and all the lessons that they'll learn, let's not forget the lessons that they can teach us as well. And I think sometimes that we forget, we're all called to be students, disciples, learners, really all of our lives. There ought not to be a day goes by that we're not striving to learn something. And sometimes those lessons are painful, aren't they? Sometimes those lessons are hard. Sometimes those lessons can be fun. But those lessons are always there if we're willing to learn them. And let's not get so focused on what we can teach others, particularly the children, that we forget the lessons that they can teach us. In fact, that's the point of what Jesus has to say to us this morning. In Mark chapter 9 and then over in Luke as well, the parallel passages, we read that the disciples had been arguing about who was the greatest. These men were so caught up in the idea of Jesus' kingdom that they missed the whole thought. They missed the whole thing. They missed the whole concept of what it meant to be a part of the kingdom of God. It was kind of like not being able to see the forest for the trees. They have their idea of the kingdom, of greatness, of power, of prestige, of position and prominence, of control, and they forgot what Jesus was teaching them. And so they fought over who was the most important. Now, I can only imagine the embarrassment that those men must have felt when Jesus asked them what they were talking about. Who would have been willing to say to Jesus, well, we were fighting over who was most important. But Matthew tells us they did ask him who was the greatest. And maybe this was after things had calmed down a little bit, and maybe they thought Jesus had forgotten their bickering and posturing for position, but you know he hadn't. Look at Matthew 18, verses 2 through 4 with me. Just a few verses, and probably some you're familiar with. But look there at what Jesus has to say. Jesus caught a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Let's think about those lessons that those children can teach us, and about the things that we must become in order to be like them. You know, one of the things children teach us, and one of the things that children are, is joyful. Children are happy, for the most part, aren't they? And it doesn't take much, most of the time, to make a child happy. You buy them an expensive present for Christmas, and they end up playing with the box. You know? You buy them something nice and fancy, and they don't want that. They want something simple. There are many verses that deal with the joy that we as Christians ought to have. And as I thought about it, the first that came to mind was the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, verses 2 through 12, where Jesus says there in the Sermon on the Mount, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. That word for blessed in those verses can just as easily and accurately be translated as happy or joyful. Jesus is saying, be happy, be joyful. Now, most of those situations or circumstances are not very positive, are they? Who wants to be poor? Who wants to be hungry? Who wants to be in need in those ways? But if we look deeper, they're not about our physical condition. They're not about being physically hungry or physically poor. They're about being spiritually poor. They're about realizing the spiritual situation we're in and realizing that there's nothing we can do about it, so we are dependent upon God. Hold that thought there. Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians from a Roman prison. And yet the theme of that book is the joy that we as Christians have, and how we need to allow that joy to overflow into our lives. At least 12 times in those 4 chapters of that short book, Paul used some form of the word joy or rejoice there. Philippians 3. Paul said, "Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard to you." In chapter 4, he said, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say, rejoice." That word has the idea of being glad or happy or even celebrating. Celebrating, Paul says. Do we think about the church as being a party? Do we think about the church as being an occasion for joy, of happiness, of being in that kind of relationship with God that we can't wait to celebrate? But that's the attitude that we as Christians need to allow to permeate our lives regardless of the situation that we find ourselves in. Paul did not write that letter from the beach somewhere. He didn't write that letter from a mountain cabin overlooking a lake. He wrote it from a prison. And yet he said, rejoice. Nehemiah chapter 8 verse 10 tells us the joy of the Lord is our strength. Now, that does not mean that we have to live a life where everything is perfect. In fact, you think back into the Old Testament, Nehemiah ministered to a people who had been exiled and finally allowed to come back to their homeland. They'd been displaced for 70 years. Finally, they were allowed to return. They were allowed to rebuild their homes, rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple. That'd be good news, wouldn't it? And yet nothing was like it was. The temple they were rebuilding was nothing like the temple that stood there before. They were still extremely poor. They were still brutally oppressed. They still had nothing. And yet Nehemiah said, the joy of the Lord is our strength. So as we think about it, why should we? Why can we have joy? Why does a child have joy? Why is a child so happy? I think it is because the child has absolute trust in their father. Consider that. When you think about it, a child has no real responsibility, do they? Except to be a child. Now, I know some of you may object. Some of you say, hey, I had a lot of responsibility when I was a child. I had a lot of chores that I had to do. I had to cut wood and haul water, and I had to milk the cow, I had to pick up the eggs, and I had to do this, and I had to do that. And some of you who came a little bit later will say, hey, I had a lot of chores to do too. Y'all had chores to do too, didn't you? Hannah and Jared, you know, we gave them chores to do and jobs they had to do as well. And it's good for a child to have responsibilities. It's good for a child to have chores and things that they're supposed to do. But let me ask, what really happened if a child didn't clean their room or take out the garbage or do whatever it was they were supposed to do? What really happened? What happened, Chris? Not much, huh? Oh, no, I know the discipline they got was terrible in their eyes, right? You know, they thought you thought was the end of the world. But if your child didn't take the trash out, if they didn't clean the room, if you didn't cut the wood when you were little, whatever it was you're supposed to do, did your parents kick you out of the house? Did they disown you? Did they make you sleep outside? Of course not. You knew you had to pay a price, but it didn't mean that your parents weren't going to love you anymore, weren't going to care for you, weren't going to provide for you. And maybe in your mind, that punishment was going to be awful. terrible. But the reality is, it wasn't so bad. Because those children always knew there would be food to eat, a place to sleep, a roof over your head, and at least two people that loved you. Right? So when you come down to it, what has a child really got to worry about? Nothing. Children can be joyful simply because they trust their Father. And as Christians today, don't we have a Father who loves and promises to care for us? So what have we got to worry about? Now, as we get older, it seems we find more things to worry about. Things like money and jobs and homes and reputations and cars and bills. And that list just goes on and on and on. But what if we let God worry about those things? Doesn't God say He knows what we need before we ask? And what if we just said, God, take care of it?